thank you first for the invitation, to speak, particularly to Mr. Ko and to Mr. Tian. What I wanted to talk about today is, yes, it's on cognitive warfare, but it's about how it's to provide solutions of how countries which don't have what they feel is a voice or a strong enough control of narrative power, how they should proceed. And I'm thinking particularly, of course, in terms of China, in China's case, because it's not just China wants to have a certain control of narrative power and equalization of narrative power, but it's hard also. I mean, China is a one-party system, it is an authoritarian system, and this has ramifications in how it is appreciated and seen in other parts of the world. And so let me proceed on that basis. I don't want to diminish the sense of the importance of cognitive warfare, though I don't think in this current Russia-Ukraine case, it is a decisive factor. Cognitive warfare and even the weaponization of brain sciences should not be dismissed as new age claptrap. Military ecosystems do tend to kind of overhype these sort of frontier technological developments, but brain sciences research is real, and there are research institutes which have been placed by the US government on their entities list for conducting this sort of research. That said, as the adage goes, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. Objective truth is not dead. Particularly in this conflict, I would say the rights and wrongs are not in question. Let me, I know this is a little bit of a sensitive area, so let me dwell when I say rights and wrongs. This is not the first time that international law is being violated in the post-Cold War order. International law has been violated on numerous occasions and with far greater loss of life by the West, and particularly the US. But the fact of the matter is that international law has not been violated as nakedly in this instance as it has been since, I would say, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. It is perhaps the most naked invasion of international law that Russia felt that it could not rebalance through geopolitical means, so it would create military facts on the ground to equalize the equation. And that's frankly not okay. But it is ironic, it's an irony that, as I talked about just now about Saddam Hussein and Kuwait, it is a measure of how poor, I would say, US stewardship has been of the rules-based order, that in this instance, the Kuwaitis even are not supporting the United States, even though the Kuwaitis were eaten up by Saddam Hussein. And so it's just a sad state of where we all stand in international law, and no major power should be putting their hand up and saying, we are the guardian. But that having been said, I think it's very clear that this is as naked a violation of international law as it goes. And that is very, very sad, and that it's coming from a P5 power. That said, outcomes in the Russia-Ukraine contest is not being determined by technology and cognitive warfare and bluff. It is being determined by the oldest of determinants in warfare. It's an asymmetry of motivation at the Ukrainian end that we will defend our land. And there's perhaps not as much of that motivation at the Russian end to make sure that they are going to do what they do, that they can achieve their ends. That said, I mean, there is a complete gap in between the powers of the two sides. And therefore, while we know in the western part of Ukraine, Russia has essentially failed, the fact of the matter is, I mean, just numbers, equipment, technology will ensure that they will succeed, prevail in most part in the eastern part. Anyway, that's setting the war element aside, the war part. Objective truth is not dead, but it is skewed in the information fog of war. High principles such as freedom of expression, non-discrimination don't hold during wartime. The real sad fact is that cable television's play on polemics and imagery really dumbed down the quality of serious network TV wartime reporting. as well as the civility of discourse. And social media has further dumbed down how cable TV's already skewed standards. And that's why even from a media standards in terms of approaching and understanding, I'm afraid, I mean, the standards are so low. And I have CNN, I have BBC, I have CGTN. I'm watching all of these, and frankly, I mean, uh, I think the West could have. We can come to that point later, but it's not been a very honest conversation, to be frank. Anyway, what I would say from the emergers point of view, and I'm talking thinking China out here, aim going forward should not be to skew information flows further. Aiming to one up the West on this front is not smart thinking. And the reason is clear. Western media discourse start out from a long-standing and superior position of credibility. Independent media have earned it over decades, over maybe century. Enhancing sophistication of communications rather than skewed flow, information flows should be the preferred plan of action. And sometimes, there's a tendency then, even in these instances when the material is supportive of say, China putting forward its point of view, its narrative, its discourse, because there isn't that sophistication, it really kind of can boomerang. We have had this discussion about wolf warrior, and it's not really worked out well for China. And let me tell you about, you don't have to get to wolf warrior, just about less than a year back, I think one of the Australians ran a war crimes inquiry with regard to some of their troops with regard to atrocities committed. And they basically redacted most of the material, so you can't see it publicly. But it was mentioned out there that certain crimes that they committed, certain acts they committed, were the worst that Australia has committed ever since it has been been sending troops overseas. It's been sending troops overseas since World War I, 100 years. Among the worst acts that have been committed were committed in Afghanistan. But when the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman put an image of a child with a knife against his neck, with an Australian flag out there, it evoked revulsion, and the story went away in a day. And therefore, the question is, even if on somewhere you have an advantage, you need to do this in a more sophisticated way. And that's why it's more about getting sophistication of communication rather than trying to skew information and becoming a credible source of information over the long run. Just give me about one more additional minute. I'll come back. I'll go through my presentation quickly. I will say one area where the US has done well in this conflict, actually parenthetically, is the positive information related, is the public release of classified intelligence, which has been provided on a more or less real-time basis of Russian troop movements, and which has been provided in advance or in real time, and which have turned out to be true. And that is an information related innovation, which has turned out to be truthful and which has really had an impact, I would argue. By contrast, Russian EWOP, electronic warfare, psyops on the ground, or cyber warriors have not been able to make a noticeable impact. And therefore, I would suggest the aim going forward should be provide a better balance of information flows. It takes time, money, effort, perseverance. For example, we hear a lot of Western reporting from behind Ukrainian lines of what's happened and of the atrocities. But I would suggest, if you want to come from the other end, we know for a month now that the Russians have been in occupation of fair amount of territory in southern and eastern Ukraine. Do we know anything what has been happening in those occupation zones? We heard about Mariupol, but in a lot of other places, are there mayors in place? Are city administrations or town administrations in place? I mean, if you want to report well and if you want to leave a mark, go out there and report what is happening from the other side. It might be a good story, it might be a bad story, but that story needs to be told. And that's the way how you can get credibility, by having a balance of information. And that's what, at the last point I will make, is as for regulating Western and social media, domestic cyberspace authorities have ample tools at their disposal to punish errors of commission and omission. During conflict periods, stricter interpretations of intermediary liability laws can be imposed. The larger challenge is not to ensure that you also want to get a few additional clicks Rather, it should be to become more balanced, better news, because at the end of the day, whether we are in the West, East, North, or South, people are looking for fair and unbiased information sources so that they can independently arrive at judgments. They don't want hegemonic media vehicles to tell them what they should hear. They want to come to their own judgments. And therefore, my question is, can non-Western media deliver on this front? Cognitive warfare may have a role to play in the lead up and during conflict periods, but it is fundamentally not the answer to the question that has been asked here. Okay, thank you.